risks of liability in extended supply chains. I'm joined by Marcus Haggard, an associate with the law firm of Perkins Coie. Hello, Marcus.
Hello.
So, based on your research and your experience, I am wondering, what are the big risks out there in terms of ensuring supplier compliance these days, both with tier one suppliers and with sub-tiers? What are the dangers and the things that manufacturers and importers need to be thinking about right now?
Well, manufacturers and importers are being held accountable more so than ever to go deeper into or higher up the supply chain. And so a lot of the companies that we work with, the clients that we work with, are struggling to figure out ways to root out unethical or non-compliant behavior deeper into their supply chain. And it's just very difficult. There's an information deficit. There's barriers to accessing information regarding suppliers that are deeper down their supply chain. And so I think the big risks are the risks that generally companies face with their first tier that have we've learned a lot about how to address those, that they just can't get farther down the supply chain. They can't get that kind of information, and yet they're being held accountable to. And so they have to work through that first tier of suppliers to try to get to the lower tier of suppliers. And so it's really at that initial relationship that they're having to reformulate their compliance suite and the materials that they work with, that they've developed to work with that first tier of suppliers. And so I think the challenge is right there at that front with that first level relationship to be able to get deeper into the supply chain.
Let's talk about this idea of a supply chain suite. What does that consist of in terms of onboarding a new supplier? What are the concerns?
Sure. So a supply chain suite is really the body of materials, the agreements, the internal policies within the company, and then the contract clauses, the questionnaires, the type of things that you use to develop a full and effective supply chain compliance program. And so typically when I'm talking about a supply chain suite, and I think there's different people have different formulations, but when I'm talking about it, or when we're talking about it, we mean these type of standalone certifications. So these are a certification that would be sent to a supplier saying, you certify compliance with the following. And often that will include you certify compliance with local and international standards, labor standards, anti-slavery standards, non-corruption standards. So these are standalone certifications. More and more, we see those certifications also saying compliance with the company's policies that you have reviewed. So if you're a company working with a supplier, you're saying, supplier, you certify that you reviewed our ethical behavior policy, our business conduct policy, and you certify to comply with those standards as well. So that would be just a standalone certification. Okay. Other things included, there's typically almost all companies that we've worked with have a specific supplier contract. And so there would be a clause that's added to that contract that specifically states that the supplier is going to comply. This suite has other things as well. Usually, if a company does not already have a business conduct or an ethical code of conduct that addresses things like labor laws and anti-corruption, then those need to be developed. They need to be included. And then the other suite components, the certification and the like, refer to those and refer back to those policies. Third-party due diligence, that's another one that increasingly, I mean, many companies are familiar with that, but trying to find third-party due diligence companies, so these are independent companies that will go in and do research, sometimes on the ground. They'll do public record searches. If necessary, they'll conduct interviews to verify whether or not the suppliers are engaging in ethical or unethical behavior, if there's a history of criminal prosecutions, things like that. And so having a good relationship with the third party supplier is necessary too.
All right. Well, so that looks like a good answer to the question I wanted to ask you next. And that is, okay, you have these suppliers who are being asked a whole series of questions about, are you doing this? Are you doing that? And of course they could just say yes. And, where do you go from there? How do you make sure that they really are doing it? So you're saying the third party system or the third party option is a good way to go. Are there other ways to make sure, even directly or indirectly, that the supplier is going to back up its claims with real action?
There are, but I mean, the challenge in this space is that it is very difficult to verify some of this information. And so, especially with the amount of suppliers that many of these companies are working with, and the distance. I mean, sometimes these suppliers are in the middle of the jungle in a remote location, and it's just, there's limited public records and the like to verify this. But there are things that companies can do. We already talked about third-party due diligence. Some of those companies have gotten very sophisticated to the level of doing on-the-ground due diligence, but even at a superficial level, or not necessarily superficial, but at a higher level, they're able to do online searches and document searches and records. They've gotten increasingly sophisticated to be able to verify that the information that's being provided by the suppliers is accurate. But there's other things as well. Audits are increasingly a norm. Being able to conduct an audit on site at a facility and determine whether or not the statements that the supplier has certified to you as the company are accurate. Agreeing to those audits at the front, that should be part of the certification, the compliance agreements with these suppliers, that they agree to be audited. Now, whether or not those are audits that there's some kind of warning in advance or not, that can be negotiated. But I think having an audit program is important. Part of that as well is a record retention program. Suppliers should agree to retain certain records that pertain to the things that they've certified to. Mm-hmm. So this third-party due diligence at the outset, and that should be recurring, whether it's on a 2-year interval, continuing to take a look and conduct those due diligence and see if there's any additional records that have come to light. And then these audits that can be conducted intermittently to verify on the ground. Outside of that, I mean, I think those are the two most impactful steps. And there's not that much outside of that.
Okay. All right. Well, on the case of audits, though, you use the word on site, which is so important. And yet these days, it's so much harder to get on site because of the pandemic, because you can't travel a lot in the last year and a half, almost 2 years. How do you then carry out these audits when on site is not necessarily an option?
Well, I think that companies can just do their best at this point. And so, I mean, as we're sitting here talking in completely different locations, getting face-to-face with people, I know often when we're asked to conduct internal investigations, we insist on doing face-to-face conversations. So there's document retention and document reviews that can be used to back up the statements made by the suppliers. But getting face-to-face with people over technology like this, Zoom calls, being able to see the facilities, maybe even being able to speak with employees in this kind of environment. And in those situations, it can be challenging because you want to try to speak to the employees without some of their superiors or managers that may be influencing them in the room. And you do what you can. But I think it's important to get face-to-face and make sure that the documents are retained.
Audits too can be carried out by a third party, can they not?
They can. And third-party audits are preferable. So if you're able to do that, then certainly.
Because third parties, they're experts, they know what to look for, right? They know how to go about the process because they do it all the time, I would think.
Completely agree, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, that's some excellent advice, Marcus Haggard of Perkins Coie, about what companies need to be doing now more than ever to protect against compliance problems in their supply chains, both at the first tier and sub tiers as well. Thank you very much for being with me to talk about this crucial issue today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.